Genesis chapter 37, we embark upon a study of the life of Joseph. And I've entitled this section, What You Meant for Evil, God Meant for Good. And really, if you look at Genesis chapter 37 all the way to chapter 50, it is really one unit. We've been looking at the life of Abraham. We've been looking at the life of Isaac. We've been looking at the life of Jacob. Now, one of the largest sections is going to be given to the life of Joseph. And I've entitled it, What You Meant for Evil, God Has Meant for Good, because when you read the end of the story, that's exactly what Joseph says to his brothers. His brothers mistreated him, and he said, look, I know what you did to me was wrong, but in the end, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And so we're going to see that unfold as we go through this section, looking at the life of Joseph. And by the way, we can say that for our own personal lives, because evil often happens to us. Now, there's two types of evil. Evil began in the Garden of Eden, and there's two types of evil. Number one, there is moral evil, and that's when somebody mistreats other people, like Joseph's brothers mistreated him. That was moral evil. Someone's raped. Someone is murdered. Someone is stolen from. That's moral evil. But there's a second type of evil that the Bible talks about, and that is natural evil. Natural evil comes about because creation groans, tornadoes, hurricanes, and in our situation right now, the coronavirus. You see, the coronavirus is part of the corruption that happened in Genesis chapter 3. Skeptics will say, well, if God is a good God and God is all-powerful, why would God allow a pandemic such as the coronavirus to happen, or the Spanish plague, or the Black Death? This hasn't been the first time, and I'll tell you what, as long as Jesus tarries, it's not going to be the last time. We're probably going to see more plagues come upon human society. And people say, well, how can God be good and allow this type of natural evil? If he's all-powerful, he would want to stop it. And the answer is, I can't ultimately answer that question. All I can say is this: what this virus is doing to accomplish evil, God in the end will use it for what? For good. He takes natural evil, he takes moral evil, and he weaves his purposes together in order to accomplish good. Now, before we actually look in the text, I want you to understand that Joseph is a type of Christ. In other words, there are parallels between the person and the life of Joseph and the person and life of Jesus Christ. Let me share them with you up on the screen. You'll notice them. Both were loved by their father. I'm not getting anything over here. I guess it won't come up. Both were loved by their father. Secondly, both were hated by their brothers. Now, we know Jesus' brothers eventually came to saving faith. Both wore seamless garments and were stripped of their tunics. Both were taken to Egypt. Both were betrayed and sold for silver. Both were servants. Both overcame temptation. Both were falsely accused. Both were punished with two others. One was saved and the other was not. For example, you remember on the cross, Jesus had the two thieves. One was saved and the other was not. And when you look at the baker and the cupbearer, one was restored to his job and the other one was killed. Both were exalted to sit at the right hand. And finally, and there are many others, but I'm just giving you a smattering here, both provided salvation. Joseph, of course, provided physical salvation, whereas Jesus provided spiritual salvation. And so we have to understand that Joseph really is a type of Christ. Now, here's what's interesting. The New Testament never mentions Joseph as being a type of Jesus Christ. And theologians will often tell you, if the New Testament doesn't mention it, you should not take Old Testament characters and make them a type of Christ. But listen, the parallels are so exact, you can't avoid not making it a type. Well, let's pick up in verses 1 and 2 as we start the narrative. It says, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned in the land of Canaan." Now remember, Jacob was in the area of Padam Aram. He lived up there for a while. It was like, 20 years? And he actually came down to the land of Canaan. And so he's been in the land of Canaan for some time now. And it says, "These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years of age." And when I read that, I thought to myself, what was I doing at 17 years of age? Think back in your mind. What were you doing when you were 17 years of age? Some of you are saying, "I was drinking beer and smoking pot. I was carousing." Or maybe you were like Joseph. Maybe you were a person of good, moral, noble character. Well, he was 17 years old. He was mature because it says he was pasturing the flock. And the Hebrew indicates here that he was more than just a shepherd. He was actually an overseer. That's why he went to check on his brothers. And so here he is at 17, overseeing the flock, maybe to some degree overseeing his brothers, although not completely. And it says, with his brothers, while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. Now, this is a diagram to give you an indication of his brothers, because this is going to play a significant role as to why Jacob played favorites towards Joseph. You'll notice these were the sons of Leah. You remember Leah was Jacob's least favorite wife. She had the pretty eyes, as it were, but he wasn't in love with her. Here are the two maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, probably concubines, maybe secondary wives. And then this was Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, and she had two sons. Joseph was the older, and Benjamin was the younger. And that's going to play a significant factor here in this narrative. And so it says in verse 2, "And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father." And so Joseph goes to check on his brothers at the behest of his father. And when he comes back, he basically gives a bad report as an overseer and basically says, "Dad, the brothers aren't doing what is right. They're horse playing. They're not fulfilling their responsibilities. We don't know exactly what they were doing, but they were neglectful." Now, obviously, he was a person of faithfulness, that is, Joseph was. He was a person of noble character to some degree because he was fastidious in the responsibilities that he had. But his brothers perceived him to be a snitch. Now, here's the question. Should Joseph have been a snitch in this situation? I remember raising my 3 daughters, and whenever you deal with sibling rivalry, one is going to often snitch out the other. Maybe you did that when you were growing up. If you have siblings, you snitched out your brother or your sister. And you know what happens when a brother snitches out another sibling? Well, the others get mad. And so the question is, Joseph should have done this? Because we know it got him into hot water. Now, obviously, on the one hand, we could say he did the right thing because if he was sort of an overseer, he had to be truthful, he had to be honest about the fact that his brothers were being slack. On the other hand, some would say he should have kept his mouth shut. I tend to lean to the fact that he did the right thing. And so here's the question. Should we ever become a snitch? And we've all faced those situations before, even as an adult. And you know what? It's always weighed on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes we need to keep our mouths shut and we don't need to get involved in certain situations because it's going to get us in hot water. On the other hand, there are times where we need to speak up because it's a matter of being truthful. And by the way, this is the first reason why his brothers hated him, is because from their perception, he was a snitch. So in verse 3, it says this, "Now Israel," that's another name for Jacob, "loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a vari-colored tunic." Now, Jacob loved Joseph more than the others. That's what it is implying here. And the reason why is because Joseph, it says here, was born to him in his old age. And also, it doesn't say here, but in previous texts, he was born to his favorite wife, Rachel. And because he loved Joseph, and that's not to say that Jacob didn't love his other sons, But you and I know as parents, if we're not careful, we can gravitate towards a child more than the other. Now, I can tell you this, I love all of my daughters equally, and I'll tell you what, I would give my life for them in an instant. I wouldn't have any problem giving my life and laying it down for my daughters. But I do know this, as a father, you're going to connect with one child over another better. It doesn't mean you don't connect with all of them, but sometimes you have a sibling that maybe you connect better with in terms of personality. And so maybe that's the case here with Jacob. He loved all of his sons, but he had this special love towards Joseph because Joseph was born to him in his old age, and also he was born to his favorite wife, Rachel. And he demonstrated his favoritism. How do I know that? Well, first of all, this doesn't say it, but in the previous chapters, do you remember when Jacob was going to have an encounter with his brother Esau? What did he do? He thought Esau was going to come against him and fight against him. And so he sent in procession his family members. And guess who he put in the back? He put Joseph and he put Rachel in the back. Because if Esau was going to wreak havoc, he was going to wreak havoc on all his other sons, and he was going to save his favorite wife and his youngest son, Joseph. And so we could see why the brothers had a little bit of resentment here. By the way, it also says here in the text, and this is what really made them mad, and this is what really demonstrated his favoritism, and that is this: he gave him a coat of many colors. Now, I remember when I was in 9th grade of high school, my dad did a family trip to New York City. That was the first time I had ever been to New York City, and I was blown away. And one of the plays that my father took us to was the play Joseph, the Coat of Many Colors. I don't remember much about the play because at the time I wasn't saved and I didn't really have a biblical knowledge, but there's been a lot of books that have been written about this, and there's been plays that have been performed based on this coat of many colors. Now, what was this coat? Well, it was a seamless garment. Many people believe that it may have had sleeves sewn onto it. There's no definitive evidence that it was necessarily multicolored, but it was a seamless garment, and it signified specialty. It signified that you were very important. In fact, it's used in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 18, when David gave his daughter Tamar a special garment. It's the same word used here. And it signified royalty. It showed that you were very important, that you were the head of the clan, and that you were going to receive the inheritance. And so you can understand why Joseph's brothers were angry, because they felt like Joseph was going to head up the family, and also he was special. You know, they say that clothes are what make a man. And generally that's true. But you know, in Joseph's case, it's not what made him, it's actually what led to his undoing. Think about this. It was the coat of many colors that somewhat got him into hot water. And it was that coat that they took and they dipped it in blood and they concocted a lie before their father. And furthermore, do you remember when Joseph was solicited by Potiphar's wife? What did she grab? She grabbed his garment and she used it as false evidence to claim that she was raped or she was advanced at Joseph's sexual advances. And so it was almost his undoing. And so it says in verse 4, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him, and they could not speak to him on friendly terms. You see, the other brothers felt rejected at this point, and this is the second reason why they struggled with hatred and jealousy. The first reason is because Joseph was perceived to be a snitch. And the second reason is because of Dad's favoritism. And listen, we would all agree here that Jacob brought this trouble on himself. He was irresponsible in giving his son that coat. He should have known that it would have caused resentment among the other children. And you know, there's a principle that the Bible says in Ephesians chapter 6 that we're not to exasperate our children. And there's a multitudes of ways that we can exasperate our children, but one of them is when we show favoritism towards one child over against the other. And you know what? Kids are very perceptive. Kids are very incisive. They can sense intuitively when one parent loves one sibling over against the other. You know, I have several grandchildren, and when I go see my oldest daughter, I have 2 grandsons, and when I walk in the house, they love to see me. And you know what I make sure when I go in, because I can read their body language? Of course, Jack is little. He's not quite understanding, but he's getting to that age where he responds to me. I make sure that I give them equal attention and that my body language is dispersed among them equally so that they see that I care for both of them. Because if I go towards one and I show this sense of love more than the other, you know what can happen over time? They may start to think, why does Grandpa tend to gravitate towards him and not me? And you know, children can sense that. I have a good friend. He has a brother. And I remember when I moved here to South Carolina, while we were driving in the truck, he told me that he grew up in a home, he said, where his brother was favored over him. And I could see the hurt that he had in his heart. He says, my parents never invite me over to the house, and he's an adult now. He says, but my brother, they call him all the time. He says, I haven't talked to my parents in years. He said, yet they talk to my brother all the time. How would that make you feel? And so as parents, we got to be careful that we don't play favorites, because you know what it'll do? It'll generate a sense of hatred. And some of you, maybe unwittingly, you have showed favoritism towards one child over the other, not realizing you're doing it. And you have to be careful, because kids are very intuitive. They pick it up. Well, in verse 5, then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. So they hated him because he was a snitch. They hated him because he was favored by dad. And thirdly, now they hated him because he's going to have a dream. And the dream, as we're going to see, implies that he's going to lord it over them. So in verse 6, he said to them, please listen to the dream which I had. For behold, and by the way, one of the ways that God revealed his will in the Old Testament was through dreams, and so dreams were very significant. They definitely were going to listen to what Joseph had to say. In verse 7, for behold, and what Joseph here is going to use as an agricultural symbol. We were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Now, obviously, this was a prophecy in the future, how one day Joseph's brothers would bow down to him, not in worship, but out of respect. Now, you can imagine they were struggling with the fire of jealousy and the fire of hatred. You know what Joseph did here? He basically took gasoline and he gaslit this whole situation. They're really angry at him because, listen, this is an act of pride on their part. Their perception is, wait a minute, you're saying that I'm going to bow down and I'm going to respect you one day? And by the way, God does this sometimes in the Old Testament. Even today, God will sometimes give prophecies of what is going to happen in the future. That's what he's telling Joseph here. Now, you got to remember, Joseph doesn't understand right now the big picture. He doesn't know how this is going to play out. And sometimes when God gives prophetic words, we sometimes don't see the fullness of the picture. In fact, if you read in the Old Testament, 1 Peter chapter 1 says that the prophets would study their own prophecies about the Messiah, and they didn't fully understand about the sufferings of Jesus and the glories that would follow. They didn't get the big picture. We look back and we can understand those prophecies. The book of Revelation, we get a grasp of most of what it's talking about. But there's specifics in the book of Revelation that we really do not understand. It's not until it happens that we're fully going to see the prophecy. And that's what's going on here. God is giving Joseph this prophecy. He doesn't fully understand it, and his brothers don't. And by the way, this is a word today that we've got to be careful that when we make prophecies about what God is going to do in the future, we better make sure we hear from God. I was watching TV last week, and Kenneth Copeland comes on. Kenneth Copeland pastors, he's one of the health and wealth preachers in Dallas, Texas. And he said he was laying on his bed with Gloria, and they were watching Kenneth Hagin. Kenneth Hagin is like the granddaddy of the Word Faith movement. He's now deceased. And they're laying in bed as a couple watching him. And he said, God spoke to me. And he said, I am going to end the coronavirus now. And he says, I hopped up out of bed, and he said, I wrote the prophecy down. Now, this was 2 weeks ago. Was he right in making that prophecy? I don't know whether God spoke to him or not, and I'm not here to get into, I don't agree with his theology in total. But you know what? You better make sure that you're careful, because here's the problem. If he made that prophecy and this thing goes on for months, you know what's going to happen? He's going to lose credibility in the sight of his people. So Joseph made this prophecy, but this prophecy was true. And so let's see what happens now. In verse 8, then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Is that what you're telling us? Are you kidding me? They knew the implications. Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And so here is the third reason why they disliked Joseph. Number one, he was a snitch. Number two, his dad favored him. And number three, because of his pride from their perception. Now, Joseph may have not meant it that way. When he said to them, I'm going to rule over you, he may not have presented it in a very arrogant and pompous way, but that is how they perceived it. And so here's a good principle. Don't ever forget this. Some things may be true, but some things are better left unsaid. It probably would have been better if he didn't say anything, but maybe in God's providence, God wanted him to say it, and he used it because later on, the brothers would realize, hey, he made this prophecy, and now we see the fulfillment of it. And so Joseph gets into hot water here. So in verse 9, now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, lo, I have had still another dream. This is a celestial dream. The other one was an agricultural dream. And behold, the sun, that would represent Jacob, and the moon, that would represent Rachel. Rachel's dead by this point. And the 11 stars, that would represent his brothers, were bowing down to me. Verse 10, he related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? I mean, even his father, as much as he loved his son, he's a little bit incensed by this. He thinks it's a little bit arrogant. His brothers were jealous of him in verse 11, but notice what it says here. His father kept the saying in mind. In other words, Jacob didn't want to totally rule out the fact that God may have been doing something in the life of Joseph. Why? Because listen, Jacob had had several encounters with God in previous chapters. Do you remember when he saw that ladder going up and down from heaven, and he saw the angels ascending and descending? You see, Jacob had had dreams before, and so he wasn't going to rule out the fact that Joseph may have had an encounter with God. And you know, this is a good principle for you and I to understand, is that God is working in this whole process, but watch this, they could not see the big picture at this point. You know what God is doing here? He's giving them a little piece of the puzzle, but he's not giving them the box top to the puzzle. Look at this diagram up on the screen. You understand this. We all know what the pieces of the puzzle are, and you know what helps us to put a puzzle together is when we can look at the box top. You see, the box top gives us the big picture, and then we have the individual pieces of the puzzle. If you and I had the pieces of the puzzle, but we didn't have the box top, we couldn't fully understand how to put the puzzle together. And that's exactly what's going on here. God is giving them pieces of the puzzle, the brothers and Jacob. But you know what? He hasn't given them the box top at this point. They don't see the full outcome. And you know, that often happens in our life. God does things in our life. He gives us little pieces of the puzzle, but we often don't see the big picture until we look back. See, it's when we look back, we see God's hand of providence. But while we're going through the suffering, while God gives me a little piece of the puzzle here, He gives me a little piece of the puzzle here, and I say, God, why are you allowing this in my life? God says, you don't understand. I see the big picture. I see the panoramic view. But God, it doesn't make sense. God says it makes sense to me, and you need to hang in there and persevere, because there's a beautiful tapestry that is being woven right now, and you cannot see it. And so we have to remember that when we go through difficulty and suffering, it doesn't make sense in the moment. God is giving us a piece of the puzzle, but you know what I often say to God? God, please give me the box top. And God doesn't do that for us. Sometimes He does, but many times He doesn't. So in verse 12, then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. So they're going out to do their responsibilities. Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? You know, at this point, Joseph's going, Dad, please don't send me out to my brothers. They don't like me. I don't want to go on a mission to check on them. He says, come, and I will send you to them. And he said to them, I will go. Verse 14, then he said to him, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. Let me know if they're horseplaying. Let me know if they're not doing their responsibilities. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And in verse 15, a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, what are you looking for? He said in verse 16, I am looking for my brothers. Now this is probably his 4 older brothers that were born to Leah: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. He says, I'm looking for my brothers. In verse 16, please tell me where they are pasturing the flock. Then the man said, they have moved from here, for I've heard them say, let us go to Dothan. Now you got to remember, this is God's providence, because He doesn't know where they're at, and this man shows up at the right time, at the right place, in order to direct him to Dothan, where he's ultimately going to be sold as a slave. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. If you notice the map here, you'll get an idea of Dothan. Here it is here. He's in Shechem. He leaves and he goes to Dothan. And right over here is where he's going to get traded. And then, of course, they're going to take him all the way down here to Egypt in this particular area here. And so this was God's providential leading right here. Who was this individual that told him where his brothers were? We don't know who the individual is, but this is God's providence. What is God's providence? God's providence simply means God provides. That's what the word providence means. It has the word provide in it. It means to see beforehand. God sees beforehand all the contingencies of life, and He's able to take your decisions and my decisions, and He's able to accomplish His purposes without doing anything supernatural. God did no miracle in this story. It was all providence. God was working behind the scenes His purposes. And you know what? There are times where you run into that person at just the right time. There's those situations where a job opens at just the right time. That check comes in the mail just at the right time. I experienced God's providence today. My wife called me. She was at the Federal Bureau where she works, and she said, can you help me out? I said, what do you need? She said, well, I locked my keys in the car. Please tell me that we have a spare key. And I said, yeah, we do. I said, all right. I said, let me go home and get the key. I said, I got to take some laundry anyway, or dry cleaning. So I got the stuff, and I went, and I pulled up to the FBI office, and there is a security gate right there. And so I parked there. That's where she told me, and I called her, and I said, I'm out front. And so while I'm waiting for her to come, security guard comes towards me. I roll down the window. We strike up a conversation. Guess where he's from? Long Island, New York. I knew it from his accent. So we got in a conversation, and he said, you know what? My dad lives in Long Island, and he has a good friend who's 41 years old, and he said he died today from the coronavirus. And I said to Bill, this security guard, I said, Bill, can I ask you a question? I said, if you were to die from the coronavirus, where would you spend eternity? And he went, that's a good question. I said, well, do you want to get to heaven? He said, yeah. I said, you know what you got to do? He said, what? I said, be perfect. He looked at me and said, well, I'm going to hell then, because I can't be perfect. I said, exactly. And I said, I can't be perfect. And I shared the gospel message with him. I gave him a Calvary Chapel business card and a Billy Graham tract. You know what? My wife locked her keys in the car so that I would talk to that man. I believe in providence. I don't believe that was an accident. I was there for that particular purpose. And so, in verse 18, when they saw him from a distance and before he came close to them, they plotted against him. So they see Joseph coming, and immediately they're thinking, man, we hate our brother. We're jealous of him. They see him, and they plot against him to put him to death. And by the way, you know where murderous actions originate? They originate in the heart. And you see, the brothers had been cultivating this hatred. The brothers had been cultivating this jealousy. And that's why if you want to deal with sinful behavior, it starts with dealing with it in the heart. The reason why they were wanting to murder him is because they had a murderous heart. And Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, you may never murder somebody, but if you hate somebody in your heart, it's as if you've murdered them. You say, man, I've never committed adultery on my spouse. Jesus says, if you look to lust after a woman, you've committed the act in your heart. We got to deal with sin on the inside. That's where it originates. Jeremiah 17 says the heart is desperately wicked. Jesus said it's from the inside of the inner man that evil thoughts, adulteries, murders, lies, etc., it comes from the inside out. They said to one another in verse 19, here comes the dreamer. That was a term of derision. In other words, this brother of ours is out of touch with reality. Here comes the dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Now, where do you think they picked up these tendencies from? Their father Jacob? Notice here they're going to concoct a lie. We're going to say a wild beast devoured our brothers. You see, Jacob was a deceiver. He was a heel grabber. Yes, God did change him. But you know what? His sins are going to come to haunt him later on in his sons. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. In other words, they thought they were going to quell Joseph's dreams. But here's the principle. Remember this. If God has accomplished or God has put something in a person's heart or God intends to accomplish something, no man is able to squash out God's purposes. You see, they thought they can crush the purposes of God, but ultimately God would prevail in the end. Why? Because this originated from God. And I don't care what anybody says. If you are doing the will of God, you are invincible until God is going to take you home. You can't thwart God's purposes. Verse 21, but Reuben, now Reuben was the oldest from Leah. You remember Jacob's favorite wife was Rachel? The one he didn't like as much, Leah. Reuben was the oldest of Leah, heard this, and rescued him out of their hands and said, let us not take his life. Now, why was Reuben coming to his rescue? Probably his motive wasn't the best. You got to remember, Reuben was in bad graces with his father Jacob. Why? Because Reuben had slept with Jacob's maidservant Bilhah in chapter 35. And so he's trying to get back in good graces with his father, and he knew that Joseph was the favorite. And so if he could rescue Joseph, he probably figured he would get back in good graces with his father. Notice the brothers wanted to kill him, and yet Reuben, even though he was badly motivated, Reuben is going to try to come to the rescue of Joseph. Now, here's another principle that you and I need to remember. When other people want to do evil, do you throw water on the fire of evil, or do you throw gas on the fire of evil? See, either you aid and abet other people in their sin, or you try to dissuade other people from their sin. We either throw water on it or we throw gas on it. And all of us have been there before when we have led other people into iniquity. See, the Bible says we're to dissuade other people from committing evil. And so, In verse 22, Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood." What does it say in Proverbs? God hates the feet that shed innocent blood. He says, instead of that, throw him into the pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. You see, Reuben knew what he was going to do. He was going to put him in the pit, and then he would come back later, and he would rescue his brother. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the vari-colored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water. It probably was an empty well. And if you notice the pictures here on the screen, you'll notice exactly what they did. You see, they grabbed him, they took his coat of many colors, and then they threw him right into the pit. And then after he got into the pit, you see him going down there. He's scared to death. And then finally, they're going to notice a caravan of Ishmaelites going by, and they're going to actually sell him. How about you? Do you ever feel like in your life you have been thrown into the pit before? You ever feel like you've been stripped and thrown into a pit? I think we've all been there before. And you know what? It's our attitude in the pit that will determine whether or not we rise above our trial or whether or not we stay in the pit. Listen, the pit is not the issue. The issue is my perspective while I'm in the pit. The issue is my attitude while I'm in the well or the pit. In fact, there's a story told about a man who fell into a pit and he couldn't get out. Buddha said, "Your pit is only a state of mind." A Hindu said, "The pit is for purging you and making you more perfect." Confucius said, "If you would have listened to me, you would have never fallen into the pit." A New Age person said, "Maybe you should network with some other pit dwellers." A self-pitying person said, "You haven't seen anything until you have seen my pit." A news reporter said, "Could I have an exclusive story on your pit?" A federal bureaucrat said, "Have you paid taxes on that pit yet?" A county inspector said, "Do you have a permit for that pit?" A realist said, "That's a pit." An idealist said, "The world shouldn't have pits." An optimist said, "Things could be worse." A pessimist said, "Things will get worse." But Jesus takes a person by the hand and he lifts them out of the pit. You see, Jesus is the one that gets us out of the pit. But sometimes, watch this, he doesn't always rescue us out of the pit. But he gives us the power, he gives us the attitude to have the right perspective while we're in the pit. And I'll tell you what, that's not always easy. That's why you've got to be in the Word, you got to be in prayer, you got to be in fellowship, because the fact of the matter is, you're going to have days where you lament the pit. Joseph was stripped and he was thrown into the pit. Well, let's see what happens as we wind down in verse 25. Then they sat down to eat a meal. Notice their hearts are hardened. They're doing this to their brothers, but they could sit down and eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites. They were the ones that descended from Ishmael. He was the other son of Abraham through Hagar, was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. This was a common trading route that they were taking all the way down to Egypt. It may have been the king's highway. Judah, verse 26, said to his brothers. Now remember, Reuben was the one who spoke out earlier. Now Judah is going to pipe up. And it said, he said to his brothers in verse 26, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood?" He said, "Look, man, if we kill him, we're not going to benefit from this," because they saw the Ishmaelites. And Judah, being a businessman, he immediately thinks, cha-ching, cha-ching. "Come," verse 27, "let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." Listen, that was a platitude. I mean, yes, it was his brother, and he's using that sort of as a front for his greed. And his brothers listened to him. And in verse 28, then some Midianite traders passed by. And by the way, many commentators believe that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are used interchangeably, although the Midianites came from Abraham's second wife, Keturah. Abraham and Keturah got married after Sarah died, and they produced a son by the name of Midian, and from Midian came the Midianites. From the Ishmaelites came, Ishmael was their father, and so they're probably mixed together in this caravan as they pass by. Then some Midianite traders passed by, and it says, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now you say, how much money is this? Well, today it would be $80 when silver sells for $10 an ounce. $80. One person said it was 3 years' wages for a shepherd. So this was considerable money. And by the way, this is a picture of Jesus because we know he was sold by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. And you know what's going on here? He's sold into slavery. Do you know this still happens today? Listen carefully. The sex slave trade. You know Colombia is a bad city for the sex slave trade? Look it up on the internet. It is still going on today, and you know why? People poach other people and sell them into the sex slave trade. It's all about money. All of us have seen the movie Taken. Even though it's unrealistic, it is a picture of what goes on in our society. It's still going on today. And by the way, we see again God's providence here. At the right time, at the right place, this caravan of Ishmaelites and this caravan of Midianites, they come together at the right time in order to pick up Joseph. You see, it was God's timing because God wanted to get Joseph to Egypt, and only God could do that. That's providence. No miracle. It was God's timing. And listen, God works in impeccable timing in your life and in my life. I've seen it in my life. And so in verse 29, now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I going to go? He's like, what am I going to do now? I'm going to get in trouble with Dad. So they took, verse 31, Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in blood, and they sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this, please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. You know what they're doing here? They're going to cover up their misdeed through a lie and through false evidence. They're tampering with the evidence. And you know what? The evidence is not always what it appears to be. We see this today when some people are sentenced to jail in a court of law. Sometimes the evidence is not really the evidence. It's not what it appears to be. And he's going to suffer as a result of this. And by the way, Jacob did this years earlier to his brother Esau. Do you remember he deceived him? And you know the principle here? We reap what we sow. Now watch this. More than we sow, later than we sow. Let me say that again. We reap what we sow. We all know that. More than we sow, later than we sow. Jacob's reaping this later. Now, we don't blame Jacob for what happened, but you know what? His sins, in a sense, are coming back to haunt them through his sons. They're going to deceive him just like he deceived his brother. And so we end with this in verse 33. Then he examined it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. By the way, this was his perception. It was not rooted in reality. It was not fact. It was a lie. But yet, perception is reality. Isn't that true with you and I? Our belief systems affect our emotions and our behavior. Listen, something may not be true, but if I believe it to be true, guess what? It impacts my emotions and it impacts my behavior. And that's why, listen carefully, it is so important that we discover the truth and we don't believe lies. Now, Jacob would have no way of realizing that this was a lie. And so, in verse 34, so Jacob tore his clothes. You can imagine the agony. You can imagine the grief. Imagine if your sons come to you and say, hey, your favorite son is dead. He is absolutely grieving at this point. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth on his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. Where's Dad? Oh, he's in the tent there. He's crying. Don't go in there. Then all of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, surely I will go down to Sheol. By the way, Sheol simply means the grave here. Hades is the New Testament counterpart. Sheol and Hades means the grave. The Jehovah's Witnesses are right to a certain degree, but it also refers to hell. It refers to eternal suffering. And so when a Jehovah's Witness says, I remember I was debating a Jehovah's Witness in Miami at my parents' house. It was Christmas Day. They don't celebrate Christmas. So I heard a knock at the door and Jehovah's Witnesses. And so I went out on Christmas Day and I'm debating them. And I'm in the thick of the argument with him, and my dad comes to the door and he says, Mike, you got a phone call. And so I go in the house and he says, I was just kidding, son. You don't have a phone call. I just wanted to get you away from him. I was like, Dad, what are you doing? I was in the middle of a conversation. But I remember in the conversation, I said, look, if you don't believe in Jesus, I said, you're going to go to hell. And you know what the guy said to me? He goes, you're right. I am going to hell. Because in their theology, hell means what? Grave. You go out of existence like a dog. You don't exist anymore. That's incorrect theology. The New Testament makes it very clear that Hades and Sheol refers to eternal torment. He says, surely I will go down to Sheol, that means the grave here, in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him into Egypt to Potiphar. And by the way, Potiphar's name means this, the one whom God Ra has given. Potiphar was the captain of the bodyguard. He was a high-ranking official. Now, let me ask you a question as we close. How do you think Joseph felt? You know, when you read the Bible, put yourself in the character's shoes. Think about this. You've known your family your whole life. You've known a certain location for a long period of time, and all of a sudden, your brothers turn against you, they strip you, and then you're sold to foreigners, and you go to another land you're not even aware of, or you have no familiarity with. Imagine how he felt. He felt fearful, he felt insecure, and he felt rejected, and he felt abandoned. Have you ever been there before where you feel lonely, you feel rejected, you feel hurt, and you feel abandoned? Listen, in the midst of that, realize this: God is still working his purpose in your life. Joseph did not see the big picture, but here's the deal. It took suffering to accomplish God's purpose. And you know what? Sometimes, in order to achieve God's purposes, we have to go through that suffering. But in the end, God brings something sweet and something good. What you meant for evil, God meant for good.